My name is Lisa, I am 37 years old, and I live with my husband Jeremy. We both work for a company founded by his father, who, despite retirement, was able to turn a small construction company into a giant corporation with an annual turnover of $300 billion. Jeremy's father, although harsh at times, earned respect and admiration for his outstanding business skills and strategic flair. He not only strengthened the foundations of the company, but also acquired many other construction firms, which helped create a large-scale business empire. Jeremy was chosen to continue his father's work, but he grew up, frankly, in an environment where his gentle nature and privileges made him a spoiled child. I'm worried about his inability to be strong enough to run such a tough business. Although gentleness can sometimes seem like a positive trait, in his case it turned into indecision and lack of self-confidence. Gradually, I began to feel that Jeremy was not only unsuitable for the role of CEO, but also unable to cope with the role of a husband. He admitted it himself, saying that he was not cut out to be a leader. Jeremy even added that if he ever became CEO, he would be more of a figurehead, not taking real action to run the company. He seems calm, accepting his position, and that makes me very upset. Jeremy and I have been married for 10 years now, and I am increasingly noticing his lack of initiative. Unlike him, I always considered myself resolute and active, which probably attracted my father-in-law, who even before our wedding saw me as a serious business partner. Before I got married, I worked in a bank, where I learned how to manage finances, and my analytical skills always came first. When I got married, I planned to devote myself to the house and become a full-time housewife, but my father-in-law offered me a job at his company. From the very first days of working at a construction company, he began inviting me to board meetings and asking for my opinion on key management issues. Although the board members were skeptical at first, seeing the founder's daughter-in-law as more of an outsider, they gradually began to respect my suggestions, which, as it turned out, benefited the company. Jeremy was also a member of the board of directors, but rarely attended meetings. It became obvious to everyone, and even my father-in-law didn't pay attention to it. One day, when I returned home after an important meeting, I saw Jeremy sitting listlessly in front of the TV. In a fit of irritation, I asked him why he was not present at the meeting, because he was a key figure in the company. Jeremy, showing no particular guilt, replied that even if he had come, he would not have been able to understand what was being discussed, and that the members of the council preferred to listen to me rather than him. My father-in-law gradually brought me up to speed, teaching me the intricacies of business management and seemed to see me as his successor. At first, I treated it as a responsibility to my family, but over time I became more and more involved in the process, almost without noticing how I got carried away with running the company. I worked tirelessly to meet the expectations of my father-in-law, whose shadow over all of us was great and weighty. About 3 years after the beginning of my participation in the board of directors, he finally retired, and at times when important decisions had to be made, the board members turned to me for advice. Jeremy, as before, stayed on the sidelines, preferring not to delve into complex business issues. I hoped that my increased contribution to the management of the company would encourage Jeremy to work harder to prove to everyone and to himself that he is capable of being a leader. But, to my disappointment, the opposite happened. Jeremy began to withdraw even more from work. Although he still showed up at the office in the morning, by noon he usually disappeared, returning home and spending the rest of the day in inactivity. When we met in the evening, he never discussed work matters, preferring to remain silent or pretend that he did not care about the company's affairs at all. Meanwhile, my workload was growing. After my father-in-law retired, the responsibilities that actually corresponded to the role of CEO fell on my shoulders. It was a huge burden, considering the scale of the company and the number of employees for whom I now felt responsible. I couldn't afford to loosen my grip, there was too much at stake. I made every effort to increase sales and profits, realizing that this was necessary not only for the prosperity of the business, but also for the well-being of our employees, who believed in me and their work. Success was not long in coming. Thanks to the joint efforts of the company, our sales began to grow rapidly. I became more and more immersed in the management process, and even felt a certain pleasure from being able to control the situation and influence important decisions. My life was increasingly centered around the company. However, the more involved I became in my work, the more my husband Jeremy became distant. His rare appearances in the office became even rarer, and our conversations at home almost disappeared. The atmosphere between us became more and more tense. I met my sister Nancy today and we had lunch together. In the evening, Jeremy returned home and said that Nancy was 3 years older than me and had recently divorced, about 4 months ago. The reason for the divorce, according to rumors, was her infidelity, which caused a loud scandal that broke out in our family. I remember the day when her ex-husband, overcome with anger, broke into our parents' house, demanding an answer. Jeremy, who has always been known for his gentle and calm nature, went there instead of me to sort out the situation because I was busy at work. His ability to calm people down played a role. He managed to convince Nancy's angry husband to leave the house, thereby avoiding a scandal. Later, Nancy told me with admiration, "Your husband, Lisa, is really an amazing man. He handled my ex so easily that even he couldn't resist Jeremy's calmness in his anger." For Nancy, who has always considered Jeremy to be just a rich and spoiled son of an influential father, this case was a turning point. Her view of him had changed, and in her eyes he suddenly became a more respectable figure, not just a nominal business owner, but a man with strength of character, even if not displayed in the way expected of him. Now, after her divorce, Nancy found herself single. Always preferring wealthy men, she may have started to look at Jeremy as an attractive prey. She was attracted to men with money, and Jeremy, despite his outward indecision, possessed what had always attracted her, wealth. But I, completely absorbed in my work, could hardly admit such a thought. Of course, my sister did not know that Jeremy actually only nominally holds his position in the company and that the true leadership has long since passed to me. Nancy was once married to a man who was considered by many to be the golden boy. Her ex-husband worked for a large international corporation, received an incredibly high salary, and was a real star in his circle. At their wedding, he boasted to me, "My husband is one of the best, and also handsome." "Lisa, you're jealous, aren't you?" I couldn't understand why my sister, who had such a successful marriage with a handsome and successful man, would commit adultery. The situation seemed even more incomprehensible than before, especially in light of everything I had learned in recent months. It's been about 5 months since Jeremy told me that he had lunch with Nancy, and this evening will remain in my memory for a long time. I returned home and noticed that Jeremy looked unusually serious, which I hadn't seen him do before. He started the conversation with a phrase that immediately caused alarm in me, "Lisa, we need to talk." My heart began to beat faster. Something bad was clearly coming. The words that Jeremy uttered next shocked me to the core. "Nancy is pregnant with my child, and I want a divorce." It sounded like a bolt from the blue. I stood in complete shock, realizing that not only was my husband asking for a divorce, but also that my sister, my own sister, was expecting a child from him. It seemed like the world had turned upside down, and I couldn't find the words. But Jeremy, as always, went on as if it was all business as usual. "Nancy will come to our next meeting to discuss this, and I expect you to be at this meeting," he added with the same indifferent intonation. I couldn't believe my ears. Through my excitement and rage, I asked the only question that was running through my head at that moment, "So, are you going to marry my sister now?" Jeremy, with the worry on his face that was so characteristic of him, replied, "It doesn't mean that I want to marry her, but if she gives birth to my child, I think I will have no choice." His typical indecision caused me another wave of irritation. I sighed, trying to keep my composure, and answered, "Well, if she's really carrying your baby, we'll have to do something about it. Let's discuss it when she comes." At that moment, I had already decided that I was divorcing Jeremy, but I still wanted to clarify the situation completely. Jeremy and I have never been able to make decisions together. And this time I realized that the only way to figure out what was going on was to talk directly to Nancy. However, before that, I should have thought about my actions from the company's point of view. My position as the daughter-in-law of the founder and my father-in-law, an influential man, could change with the divorce. What will happen to me in business? The next day, I went to my father-in-law to discuss the future. I told him the whole situation as it was. Jeremy had asked for a divorce. Nancy was expecting his child. My father-in-law, to my surprise, seemed more worried about his grandson's future than about the fate of the company. After a moment's thought, he smiled and said, "Lisa, I want you to continue running the business as you have been doing so far. Don't worry about Jeremy, I'll deal with him myself. Let him do what he wants." His words surprised me, but at the same time I felt relieved. My father-in-law clearly appreciated my work in the company more than his son or even his future grandson. Although he had long since left the post of founder, his voice still carried a lot of weight in the company, and no one would dare to go against his will. Deep down, I didn't want to give up either. Work became more than just a responsibility for me. It was my passion, my place of strength. But there was still a conversation with Nancy ahead. On the appointed day, she came to my house with a big smile on her face, as if anticipating the celebration. "Lisa, I'm so sorry that you can't have children," she said with mock sympathy. "But don't worry, I'll give you a good amount of money as a consolation. Please leave this house as soon as possible." Her words were said with such complacency that I could barely contain my anger. My husband, who was sitting silently next to me, did not interfere in the conversation, although he was the cause of all this drama. I looked at him, hoping for some kind of reaction, but he just kept silent, clearly not wanting to accept any responsibility. Indignation boiled up inside me. "Okay," I replied coldly, "divorce is not a problem. But the issues of alimony and division of property will also have to be resolved. We will invite lawyers and do everything as it should be done." I continued ironically, "I never would have thought that you, Nancy, would fall in love with a man like Jeremy." Her face contorted with anger for a moment, but she quickly pulled herself together, returning to her usual smug expression. At that moment, I finally realized that it wasn't about Jeremy as a person at all. My sister didn't see him as attractive or charismatic. All she was interested in was money and position. When the discussion came to an end, my sister triumphantly announced that she would start living in our house, and had already called the moving company to move her things. She believed that this step was the final point in her victory. Of course, I took out only the most necessary things, because I foresaw the development of events in advance and, knowing Nancy's irrepressible nature, managed to arrange a new apartment for myself. My inner peace was the result of a well-thought-out plan. I had already hired a lawyer and prepared documents for the division of property and alimony. The next day, after I moved my things, official negotiations began. We met with Jeremy and Nancy in the presence of lawyers to discuss alimony and division of property. Jeremy was still sitting with an indifferent, almost impassive expression on his face, as if everything that was happening did not concern him at all. Nancy, as always, was full of enthusiasm and self-confidence, interrupting all the time, trying to negotiate as if she were in charge here. As I said, "Lisa, I'm ready to pay you as much alimony as you want, so just decide and tell me how much you want," she said with a note of disdain. Upon hearing this statement, my lawyer, with a straight face, offered to demand alimony not only from Jeremy, but also from Nancy. Knowing that she was still paying money to her ex-husband in installments after the divorce, he foresaw that demanding another financial burden from her might be difficult. However, since she so confidently offered me any money, I decided to file a lawsuit and test her resolve. When the conversation turned to the division of property, the situation took an unexpected turn. Nancy said with obvious excitement in her voice, "This mansion originally belonged to Jeremy's family, so it shouldn't be included in the property division." She spoke with such confidence, as if her words were indisputable. However, the lawyer calmly and confidently replied, "This house and land belong to the company, so any decision on ownership will be made by the company." My sister, clearly stunned by this statement, glanced at Jeremy, who also looked a little confused. Although he continued to speak with indifference, "I always thought the house belonged to Dad." Jeremy's words were casual, as if he had never thought about who actually owned the property we had lived in for so many years. But Nancy's reaction was much more emotional. She exclaimed, "What do you mean, I can't live in this house?" The lawyer, keeping a businesslike tone, replied, "Since this is the property of the company, you can continue to live here if the company allows it." For a moment, Nancy sighed with obvious relief, as if this issue had been resolved in her favor. Oh, you should have said that right away. Everything will be fine, because Jeremy is the president of the company, and he will, of course, allow me to live here, she added with a smug confidence that was immediately destroyed by the lawyer's subsequent comment. Oh, no, you're wrong. Lisa is the president, not Jeremy, he said with a chuckle. The sight of Nancy getting ready to marry Jeremy without knowing even the most basic things about his position in the company made me chuckle. The sister abruptly turned to Jeremy and exclaimed, Jeremy, aren't you the president? I finally decided to step in and calmly explained, Jeremy is just an advisor. He doesn't have any executive rights. I am the CEO and president of the company. My words caused confusion in Nancy, who probably did not expect such a turn. All this time, she believed that Jeremy was an influential figure running a business, and her dream of becoming the wife of an important businessman collapsed in an instant. The founder of the company, my father-in-law, was president until his resignation, after which I was appointed to this position, I continued. Other managers appreciated my work, and no one objected to my appointment. As for Jeremy, he receives a salary as an advisor, thanks to an agreement with his father, but he has no real responsibilities. He just gets paid for a role he doesn't perform. It was a kind of paradox. Jeremy officially received the salary of the head, but in fact his duties were reduced to zero. Moreover, his salary was much less than he probably expected, and even less than an ordinary employee of the company would receive. All the financial issues in our family were on me, and Jeremy didn't seem to think about our budget or who owned our house. Although the house really belonged to the company, my responsible father-in-law always charged me rent, as if it were an ordinary rental property. I took it for granted, realizing that, despite all the nepotism, business is business. The lawyer, still laughing, asked me if we could continue to rent this house to Jeremy, as before. My sister, not understanding the essence of the issue, reacted sharply to the lawyer's words. What do you mean by rent? Do you want me to charge Jeremy's rent? But this is our house, isn't it? She looked so sure she was right that her reaction was almost comical. But the lawyer, restraining a smile, calmly replied, This is the property of the company. If you are not willing to pay rent for her, then just vacate her. Hearing this, the sister frowned, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. The lawyer presented her with the rental amount, and her reaction was predictable, shock. Jeremy, who seemed to have heard about it for the first time, also looked shocked. Guess what, Jeremy, I said with a touch of irony, a big house has high rents. Jeremy, who still couldn't believe what he had heard, muttered, I can't afford it with my salary. His executive compensation, as he called it, left him virtually no money, especially if he had to pay such rent. They both began to realize that with their current incomes, they would not be able to cover even basic living expenses. Throughout our 6-year marriage, Jeremy relied entirely on his modest payments, which not only did not help our family, but also created an additional financial burden. My salary also disappeared into the abyss of rent payments and lifestyle expenses, and as a result, there were almost no assets left. The only solution was to separate savings and property, which was also a difficult process. When the lawyer left, my sister, who had been making plans for life in the mansion, seemed absolutely devastated. She sat silently, staring at one point, as if she had suddenly lost all her confidence. Jeremy, as always, stood with his usual smirk on his face, as if what was happening concerned him only superficially. I couldn't help but smile sarcastically and suggested, Why don't you move out and go back to your parents' house? Your mother was so happy about the pregnancy news that she would surely welcome you with open arms. Jeremy, to my surprise, agreed, but I couldn't help laughing inside. It was funny for me to watch how this man, who was once my husband, was going to become a father, but at the same time he did not think at all about the reality of his situation. Looking at all this, I began to worry about whether Jeremy, so unreliable and careless, would really be able to raise a child. However, I soon dismissed these thoughts, deciding that it was no longer my business. Everything about their future life was no longer part of my concern. I shifted my gaze to my sister, who was still in a state of shock. Her dreams were shattered. She seemed to have completely forgotten about her loud statements about money and self-confidence. "You seemed so confident," I said to her, "when you talked about paying alimony. But you're already paying your ex-husband, aren't you?" These words seemed to rouse her from her reverie. She looked at me in confusion. "Alimony? Do I have to pay too?" "What is it?" she asked in amazement, as if she had never heard the word before. It was clear from her reaction that she hardly listened during the negotiations, completely carried away by her fantasies about the future with Jeremy. "You said yourself that you were willing to pay a lot of money to Al," I continued, reminding her of her big promises. But judging by her face, she did not expect at all that this would result in a real need to pay. "My salary is too small for that," she exclaimed, and at that moment her confidence completely disappeared into thin air. Jeremy and my sister exchanged confused glances, as if they suddenly realized what a financial abyss they had fallen into. Looking at these two, so different, but at the same time surprisingly identical in their helplessness, I wanted to laugh. But instead of laughing, I felt a little regret. My life has already gone the other way. I got all the necessary signatures on the divorce papers, and the alimony formalities were almost completed. Everything was coming to an end, and it didn't really matter to me. But to see them both in such a state was sad. My ex-husband, who has now married my sister, has returned to his parents' house, as I predicted. However, living in their parents' house did not bring them the expected peace. The constant quarrels between my sister and Jeremy's relatives have become a new drama in their lives. The main reason for the conflict, as it turned out, was the lie about my sister's pregnancy. Jeremy's mother, who had hoped so much for her grandson, was furious when she found out that there would be no children. But my father-in-law, a strict man and not prone to sentimentality, did not like my sister from the very beginning. He never approved of her, believing that she had stolen his son from me. After all the events, he stopped talking to her at all, considering her only the cause of many problems in the family. Jeremy found himself even more isolated. As I watched all these events unfold, I couldn't help but wonder how Jeremy and I got to this point. When he first agreed to return to his parents' house, I immediately realized that this was the only reasonable way out of the situation. His mother was delighted with this news. In her eyes, Jeremy was still a child who needed attention and care. However, I was still worried. Jeremy was completely unprepared for a real adult life, for the responsibilities that marriage obligations impose, not to mention parenthood. His indifferent attitude, both during our marriage and after, has not changed. I doubted it would ever change. When I saw the look on my sister's face when she realized that she really had to pay alimony to her ex-husband, I could barely keep from laughing. It was almost comical. She was so confident in herself, so determined to take control of her life and her relationship with Jeremy, that she didn't even think about how much her own financial situation was already on the verge of collapse. Adding additional financial obligations would only worsen her already precarious position. I wondered how anyone could be so naive. Perhaps my sister just couldn't see beyond her dreams of a carefree life, and reality caught up with her too abruptly. The negotiations on alimony and the division of property went surprisingly smoothly, although I expected more resistance. My lawyer was attentive and scrupulous, made sure that everything was settled fairly and in my favor. Jeremy and my sister looked confused. Their reaction was as if they were facing real life for the first time, where money does not come just like that, but you have to pay for everything. They exchanged puzzled glances, as if they did not understand how quickly and irrevocably their situation had changed. Leaving the house that was once Jeremy's and mine was an important step for me. I had already found a new apartment, and the thought of starting over from scratch brought a sense of relief. The house that I once considered my refuge has now become a symbol of an oppressive burden. And although he was the property of the company, not ours, the feeling of freedom after leaving him was almost tangible. I felt that with this house, I was finally parting with the last remnants of my past life with Jeremy. After I left, the tension between my sister and Jeremy's relatives only intensified. Lying about the pregnancy destroyed the last crumbs of trust that could once have existed between them. Jeremy's mother, who was looking forward to her grandson, was furious when she found out that there would be no baby. But the greatest anger was caused by my father-in-law, a strict and inflexible man. He disliked my sister from the very beginning and always saw her as a threat to our family. This last lie only confirmed his worst fears, and he was not shy about expressing his disapproval. His contempt was obvious, and he coldly stated, "I have no reason for you to call me Dad." My sister's dreams of a comfortable life supported by Jeremy's family collapsed overnight. She found herself without the support she had been counting on. When the truth came out, she couldn't stand the oppressive atmosphere and ran away from home. No one knew where she had gone, and to be honest, it didn't cause much surprise. She disappeared, leaving behind only chaos and ruined relationships. Trying to marry my ex-husband for the sake of financial stability turned out to be a complete failure for her. Instead, she only dragged him and herself into an even greater abyss of problems. My ex-husband, realizing the abyss he had fallen into, probably thought about coming back to me. But his father, who always plays the role of the stern voice of reason, sharply rebuked him. "You're the kind of man who should never even think about starting a family," he said. "You can't take good care of yourself, let alone others." These words, spoken with such cold confidence, completely dispelled any thoughts of reconciliation. I came out of this ordeal, leaving behind all the drama and tension that consumed my marriage. I focused on my job, on my new life, determined never to look back again. Jeremy and my sister continued to live their confused lives, but I was no longer a part of this story. I no longer cared what happened to them, because I made conclusions that changed me forever. This experience has become an important lesson for me about trust, responsibility, and the need to make decisions on my own. I have learned never to rely on others for my well-being and happiness again. Even if Jeremy had begged me to come back, I would never have been able to trust him again. His indifference, his betrayal, and his complete lack of responsibility destroyed everything that was between us. His dismissal from a senior position was the culmination of everything I had known about him for a long time. He has always shown indifference to our relationship, just as he did to his job, and now the consequences of his irresponsible behavior have become inevitable for him. Now that he's been demoted to a temporary employee, it just confirmed my decision to move on without him. Jeremy was not a man you could rely on, either in your personal life or in your professional life. The company, which had previously entrusted him with leadership powers, made it clear that he did not meet the expectations that were placed on him. Seeing him turn from a manager into a temporary employee proved once again that my choice to leave him was the right one. On the contrary, I continue to hold the post of CEO, and this has become an important part of my life. The management of the company has given me not only a sense of purpose, but also deep satisfaction from what I do. I am proud of my work and the results I have achieved. It's not just a business for me, it's an opportunity to change people's lives for the better. I see how every day my management helps motivate employees, guide the company forward, and this sense of importance energizes me. My role as CEO has become an integral part of my personality. An inner sense of responsibility and commitment makes me get up every day thinking about how I can make the company better for our employees and their families. I feel like I owe it not only to myself, but to all those who work with me. This is a kind of a marriage with the company, which requires dedication, passion, and constant self-improvement. I don't see myself in another marriage right now, at least not in the near future. After all I've been through, the idea of a new relationship seems distant and even repulsive to me. I've been through enough emotional turmoil, and now my attention is completely focused on my career. My ambitions are vast, and I don't want anything to distract me. Now I am striving for professional achievements, and for this I need full concentration. I keep in touch with my former father-in-law, and his advice is still very valuable to me. In difficult moments, when I am faced with difficult decisions, his experience and wisdom help me to remain confident in my actions. Our relationship has become stronger, and I am glad that I can rely on him as a mentor. At the moment, my attention is completely focused on managing the company, and I perceive this as an important part of my life. In this context, my commitment to work is akin to marriage. It requires the same efforts, patience, passion, and, most importantly, a willingness to move forward despite difficulties. I strive to provide our employees with a stable future, because their well-being is an integral part of my responsibility. This is where I find the meaning of my work and the strength that helps me move forward. This path has taught me a lot about perseverance and how important it is to stay true to my principles, despite all the personal problems that I have had to go through. I managed not only to keep the company afloat, but also to achieve its growth. It wasn't easy, but every step, every success convinced me of the correctness of the chosen path. Knowing that my work benefits not only me, but also hundreds of other people, I feel satisfied, which nourishes me and gives me the strength to continue. My personal life has been full of ups and downs, but my professional career has become the very island of stability that gives me confidence in the future. I found my motivation in leading the team, building a successful future for all of us and creating conditions where everyone will feel like a part of something bigger. In the foreseeable future, I intend to direct all my forces there,